Welcome to the Fatigue Files, a podcast that explores fatigue conditions from as many angles as possible while pushing the boundaries of thinking about fatigue as a signal to the 21st century and beyond. Cutting-edge thinking, practical strategies, thought-provoking explorations. They're going to all be here, and I'm your host, Anna Greer, welcoming you to this edition of the Fatigue Files. So welcome everyone to another edition of the Fatigue Files. I'm delighted to have my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Evan Hirsch, also known as the Energy MD. And Evan has done amazing work. He's seen literally thousands of people recover from ME/CFS and long COVID. And I'm always really delighted to catch up with him because honestly, guys, he's one of the most wonderful practitioners with incredible personal integrity. And he has enormous depth of compassion and insight. So I'm absolutely delighted to have him back on again. Evan, welcome.
With that kind of introduction, I don't know if I can go on.
I think you can. I think you're going to have to. So, Evan, just before we started, we briefly touched on the relationship between ME/CFS and long COVID. And I'd love you to be able to explore that a bit because I know you've got enormous experience now with long COVID as well as years and years of experience with ME/CFS. So what insights can you throw for people on the relationship between them, the identity between them, the differences, if there are any, and how you see any difference in any trigger to those conditions?
Yeah, I see long COVID really as ME/CFS with a different trigger. So when I look at ME/CFS, it's generally going to be triggered by one thing, but there's already a stage that's been set. So I talk a lot about the toxic five, which is a combination of heavy metals, chemicals, molds, infections, and nervous system dysfunction or trauma. And essentially, any one of those things can be the trigger, but all of those things are already present in the human body that ends up allowing the ME/CFS in order to progress. And just for semantics, the definition of ME/CFS, it's different outside of the US than it is inside, but essentially it's having symptoms such as fatigue, overwhelming fatigue and post-exertional malaise, brain fog, body pain, sleep issues for 6 months or longer. And right now with long COVID, it's generally for longer than 2 months. And it's all of those symptoms plus loss of sense of smell and taste. That's kind of like one of the nuances to the long COVID, though not everybody ends up getting that symptom. So essentially it's, with long COVID, it's somebody who has an acute viral illness. Don't know whether or not it's COVID based on imperfect laboratory testing. So, you just have to go by the fact if you have a viral illness that you have acutely, symptoms either persist or they go away and then they come back and then you have those symptoms for at least 2 months. That's kind of diagnosable at this point for long COVID or post-acute sequelae for SARS-CoV-2, right? Which is the long term for long COVID. Hopefully that answers some of the question. The trigger is going to be different. So it's going to be the spike protein or the COVID virus that ends up getting in the body. And the reason why it ends up taking hold in about 35% of people who end up getting acute COVID. So just for clarity, about 35% of people who get acute COVID or acute viral illness right now end up progressing to these persistent symptoms. Okay. So So that trigger is then the spike protein or the COVID virus. And so that's kind of like, that's a much higher number than what we've seen previously with Epstein-Barr virus, et cetera. So some of these things with ME/CFS. So I do have concerns for the future for what this is going to look like. There are definitely people who are self-limited, where basically their symptoms get better and they resolve over time. But at this point, the people that I'm seeing are people who have been sick for between 1 and 5 years, rather, since this has been going on since 2020, and their symptoms are not resolving, and they feel like they've tried everything. And we can kind of get into a little bit more of that, but I'm going to stop talking since I'm kind of blabbing on here.
Not at all. So what I'm hearing is that the landscape, in a sense, of the viral trigger is similar to ME/CFS in that the viral trigger can be key for some people with ME/CFS in this broader context of kind of a multiplicity of pressures that pre-exist on the body. But in the case of long COVID, it's specifically that virus and specifically the way that that virus interacts with human physiology.
That is absolutely correct and much more articulate.
So the treatment then, presumably you take a broad brush, similar layered approach to long COVID as you do with ME/CFS. Do you want to say a bit more about how you approach the kind of healing process with people?
Absolutely. So the first step is to figure out the causes that people have. So I know with everybody that I see, I'm going to address the toxic five, the heavy metals, chemicals, molds, infections, and nervous system dysfunction. And then the question is, and also adrenal gland dysfunction and mitochondrial dysfunction, because those are inherently linked with having low energy. Because you can have, people can have long COVID and not have fatigue. So you can have the loss of taste and smell, you can have body pain, etc., sleep issues, and not have the fatigue. It just depends on whether or not the mitochondria is significantly damaged, which is found in every cell in the body except for red blood cells and makes about 70 to 90% of our energy, and whether or not it affects the hormones negatively. And so the adrenal gland really is the sentinel gland. It's responsible for managing stress in the body, and it's our get up and go hormone. So it depends on how much that's been compromised.
Right.
So then other questions, go ahead.
No, carry on.
I was going to say, and so the rest of that first step is to figure out what other causes somebody has. So do they have, and I like to compartmentalize these causes into deficiencies and toxicities. So deficiencies are things that are not in the body that are supposed to be, things like hormones. So whether it's adrenals, thyroid, or sex hormones, the mitochondrial dysfunction we mentioned, vitamins and minerals, lifestyle habits. So not enough good food, not enough good water, not enough good sleep, not enough good movement, or deficiencies in mindset. And so we look at all of those to determine, whether or not there are deficiencies present, and then the toxic five to look at whether there's toxins and infections present, in addition to the nervous system dysfunction, and then also electromagnetic frequencies, and then also structural dysfunction. So those are kind of the big categories. So the first step is to figure out the causes that an individual has. And then the second step that we do is to start replacing the deficiencies, the vitamins, minerals, lifestyle habits, etc. Because even though this process is all about removing the toxic five, we have to set the body up for success. And by replacing the deficiencies, people get more resilient, it decreases inflammation, it improves sleep, etc. So it allows them to be just a little bit more successful. Hopefully there's a little bit of an uptick in energy, maybe from a 4 out of 10, if 10's ideal energy, to a 5 out of 10. Generally just makes crashes a little bit better, less frequent. And then step 3 is to open up the exit pathways in the body, liver, kidney, lymph, neural lymph that's in the brain to get rid of the trash out of the body, gallbladder pathway, and then also the intestines. So opening up all those pathways so that when we go into step 4 and we start removing the toxins and infections, they actually have a place to go. Because that's really, from a scientific standpoint, the rate limiting step. Like what inhibits our ability to get the toxins out of the body. And it really is how clogged these pathways are. And the more toxins and infections you have, the more clogged they are, unfortunately. So, we kind of want to detoxify at a rate that the body can tolerate. And every body is different, right? So just really important to make sure that we're doing that so that people don't feel excessively worse going through this process. You might feel a little bit worse as we're trying to figure that out, but there's a very specific way that we can do this in order to make sure that, yes, you're going to have success, but we have to remember slow and steady wins the race. And anybody who's had, any sort of hammer of a treatment, like a high dose IV treatment or ozone or I don't know what else, EWAT or something like that, oftentimes, or EBU, oftentimes those are really big hits and very stressful on the body, and and it's trying to move things too quickly. So really slow and steady wins the race with so much of this.
Absolutely. It sounds as if there might be precursor patterns in embodied life that are there before the tipping point where illness becomes an emergent property. So, different bodies will receive viruses in different ways. I mean, we've got, is it 70,000 viruses in our body at any given moment anyway? It's not as if viruses are just invaders. We actually co-evolve with them, and there's evidence of viral implications, viral influences in our DNA. These are kind of part of the chorus of our becoming. And so the question I'm always interested in around these things is, what are the pre-existing things that are going on in the system before those viral tipping points where, obviously with the long COVID, we had no easy immune knowledge of this novel form of the coronavirus. It's not as if coronaviruses were unknown to the human body, but that particular novel form of the virus was. But are there patterns that you see, Evan, in terms of pre-existing lifestyle patterns, stress levels, other kind of pathways that would predispose someone towards ME/CFS or long COVID, whereas others might be more resilient and actually flick the virus off or rebalance much more quickly? Do you see patterns there? And if so, what are they?
Absolutely. I mean, it all really starts with our ancestors. So there's genetics, there's trauma that's been passed down through the genes. This has been studied, very interesting studies of like stressing out grandpa and then skipping a generation and then providing a stimulus, but not the prolonged stress, and the grandchild acts in the same way as the grandpa as if they've been chronically stressed, right? So there is that. Then there's also the toxins that we get through the placenta. There's studies to show that over 300 different chemicals are found in babies' cord blood. And so consequently, we come out of the womb already with a lot of these toxins, which are going to cause immune system dysfunction and nervous system dysfunction. And then there's the stress of mom and then the stress of society, right? So we're getting all of the toxic five even before we really start our journey on this life. So we're getting the toxins, the infections, and then the nervous system dysfunction as well from all of these stressors. And then we have our own accumulation. So for me, my story was that I ate a lot of tuna fish growing up. Tuna is very high in mercury. I had mercury fillings. Every time you bite down, it releases mercury vapor. And, so I had a lot of mercury in my body. And then the chemicals, in the 80s, we weren't talking about organic food, right? And so we had non-organic food, pesticides, herbicides, plastics, putting plastics in the microwave, living in any building that had any sort of water damage in its history. And obviously you have more history in Europe than we have here, but regardless, there could be a busted pipe, there could be a leak in a roof, there could be a flood in the basement, and then we end up getting mold exposure. So all of that accumulates until the body says, hey, we got to call it quits. I really need to rest and rejuvenate because it's kind of too much for me. Or there's an infection that's taking over the mitochondrial production, getting into the mitochondrial DNA, and the body is like, you know what, I don't want to increase my production of energy because that's actually just going to feed this particular infection and allow it to propagate as well. So, the body ends up calling it quits after having those exposures. So that's a lot of it, and a lot of these, 80% of these deficiencies that we're talking about, hormones, mitochondrial function, vitamins and minerals, those all come from the toxins, the toxic five. And the only other contributors are really the lifestyle habits. So, for a lot of folks, they can get significantly better by improving their lifestyle habits, getting good food and good water and good sleep and good movement. Optimizing those can make a big difference, decrease inflammation. But for the people that I see, they've tried that. And then they go and they see a naturopath or an integrative doctor, a functional medicine doctor, and they start replacing their deficiencies. And they get to a certain point and then they plateau because they don't realize that the toxic five are really causing so many of those deficiencies. And they're the most important thing to focus on.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I kind of want to play with this language of dysfunction a bit, because it seems to me that when mitochondria decide that there's a toxic dimension in their environment, or that there's, a viral attack in mitochondrial DNA and they shut down, I don't see that as dysfunctional. I think that's,
Right.
I think that's highly intelligent.
Hmm.
And, it's a bit like if I've got a petrol car and I fill it with diesel, and then I say the car's dysfunctional, kind of a bit cheeky of me. And so I think we modern humans, tend to think of dysfunction because we have this kind of expectation that our body is almost like a wet machine that has to keep going no matter what we do. And often we're not even aware of what we're doing. Like, we're not aware, for example, I wasn't aware, leading up to my last relapse, I wasn't aware, for example, of the toxic implications of junk light for mitochondrial function. I wasn't aware that, I really didn't know, and it sounds stupid, but I really didn't know that I evolved. We evolved in a world with just natural light with different wavelengths that communicate intelligently to our cells throughout the day, not just visually, but through the skin, and that we are these kind of cellular complexes. And I've started, Evan, to think more and more at a cellular level, because it seems to me that everything you're saying is about a fundamental mismatch between the cellular intelligence of the body as a very ancient form of multiple knowings and modern day pressures. So even the nervous system so-called dysfunction seems to me to be a mismatch between a nervous system that evolved to deal with sudden stresses and then to be able to rest, digest, relax, and reproduce. And the kind of drip, drip, drip of stressors of multiple kinds on the system that then naturally takes it into a kind of low-grade sympathetic constant arousal, which it was never evolved for, or deeper into a kind of parasympathetic freeze if we're talking extreme trauma states. And that the fundamental mismatch there then is between the evolutionary intelligence of the body and the world in which we live. And I'd love to explore that with you a bit more, particularly around maybe the nervous system, because I know you've added nervous system more than you used to lately. You've taken that whole stuff a bit more into account with the whole frame, and I'd love to explore that a bit with you. Like, why did you do that, and what difference has it made? And do you think the nervous system is really dysfunctional, or it's kind of communicating intelligently about this deeper dysfunction, which is this mismatch between how we live and how we actually evolved to live?
Yeah, I'm glad that you called me out on that because, it's been my habit to talk about it, in a state of dysfunction, like what isn't working, right? But the reality is that it is very intelligent and it understands and it is functioning correctly in the fact that it's noticing that there are undue stressors and it's saying, okay, what you need to do as a human is you need to relax and you need to rest and you need to replenish, right? So it is that incongruence with societal pressures and the requirements that we have in order to exist in this society. We need to work, the majority of us, right, in order to be able to provide for our families. And unfortunately, the current status is that we need to work for 40 hours a week, which I think is not really healthy for the human existence. So I definitely appreciate that, and I need to think of a different way of stating it because it's not really dysfunction. It's more of dysfunction in accordance with the societal's view of function. Um, and the reality is that it's not producing the energy that it needs to be producing to be able to be. I mean, even regardless of society, if we didn't have any societal pressures and we're going back, you know, 10, 20,000 years, and we're living off the land. If somebody had chronic fatigue, they would rest for a period of time, but I'm not sure that they would necessarily get over it.
Mm-hmm.
So the mitochondria still is not working correctly because of all of these insults that need to be removed. So it's somewhere in between there, and I don't exactly know how to talk about it best, but I definitely agree with you on that.
Yeah, I imagine if someone didn't get over it in the past, again, it would be because the mitochondrial quorum sensing was saying there's a danger, and closing down energy production for whatever reason. And we know, for example, that even a negative thought sends mitochondrial DNA into the bloodstream or something like that. And, a negative thought immediately gets different neurotransmitters online. And it's, we are one tidal kind of, I love to think of as tides of becoming, and how this is kind of like one system in which thinking emerges neurochemically, but we also have neurochemical tides of things that affect us when we think in certain ways. We can set ourselves up in habitual thinking patterns if we're not eating properly, if we're lacking serotonin in the gut, 90% of which is produced by gut bacteria. So we've got all these kind of complex dynamics that are highly intelligent. What I love about it all, Evan, is the simplicity of actually what the body really requires. It's complex because of the mismatch between the body and the world we live in. But so, for example, I might need to put red light, glasses on to block blue light spectrums in the evening. But the simple answer is my body just needs the red light because that's how it evolved over time. So if I was following sunrise and sunset without house lights, that's kind of a simple thing. And it's easy to kind of underestimate the power of that. But we know that trillions of bodily functions depend on circadian biology and the body's capacity to know where it is and when it is, because the organs all have their own circadian sensing and clocks. And in every organ, there's like trillions of cells with, thousands of mitochondria in them. And so is this kind of chorus, a kind of cascade, if you like, throughout the day. And I think it boils down to very simple practices, even though the science that we're beginning to discover, to see the wonderful complexity of it. We're looking through the lens of new biology and quantum biology and things like that. That's mind-blowing in its complexity, but it comes down to some very simple practices, added to by the sophistication of approaches such as yours, which say simple practices plus we need to do these orderly interventions with the skill set we've developed through functional practice. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that, we've had to ratchet up the lifestyle practices. I mean, number one, because we don't have very good education about it, right? There's no FDA or whatever governing body telling us that we're supposed to do these things which are best for us. And the other thing is that, if you grow up without a lot of trauma, you used to be able to just trust that you'll be fine in this world. But now there is so much daily trauma and stress that everybody has to up their mindset and nervous system retraining, brain retraining, self-hypnotherapy work, right? In order to be able to function at an optimal level and to feel safe, which is really I believe, one of the most important parts of healing, right? So to dovetail on your previous question around the nervous system retraining, I've incorporated it into our program just in the last 6 months because I saw how much success people had in other nervous system retraining programs. And so ours doesn't go into as depth as the Gupta program or DNRS or the Primal Trust, but we provide people with a basic and then more advanced version where they can do that in context of the other things that we're doing. But I've just seen so many people have so much more success when they're doing that work in conjunction with getting the crap out of the body.
Yeah.
With the Toxic 5.
I love the fact that you've got it in a context. For me, I think the whole nervous system debate gets a bit reductionist, and that people confuse necessary and sufficient conditions. So I would say nervous system function, sufficient nervous system flexibility and resilience, a fully functional, responsive nervous system response is a necessary condition for healing, but not a sufficient one. And I think part of the problem why this gets so heated sometimes online is you've got people basically implying it's sufficient to train the nervous system, and the whole answer lies in brain and nervous system retraining. And that's a problem because for some people it will be sufficient depending on the precise genealogy of their particular condition. And we also know it's hugely influential. It's a huge pivot point. But we also know that to put that out there as if it is the answer is also problematic for all those for whom actually There are more complex layers in play. And I can't tell you how many clients I've had who've tried literally almost every program and have faithfully applied it and still haven't got the results and have felt like failures because of the framing.
Right.
And if there's one thing I would want to really push back against, it's that framing, because I think we have to start embracing complexity, but understanding that that doesn't mean it needs to be ultra complicated in how we approach it. We have to understand complexity, I think, and work in multi-layered, simple ways that over time amount to well-being, amount to turning, in a different direction. And nervous system function, I think, is key to that. But nervous system function is also more than me in my cranial brain telling my body it's safe. It gets safety from daylight. It gets safety from early morning sunlight, because that's what the cells understand as sufficiency. I get safety from eating early morning protein because my body, as an amino acid hunting machine, gets sufficient amino acids and knows that there's resting sufficiency. So I think it's so material, and that we need to move away, in my view, from thinking about it in very monodimensional ways, which I think some programs do get a bit monodimensional. And I love the fact that you've got it alongside these other factors, because it seems to me that you're taking the materiality of it all much, much more seriously than some of those other programs.
And I'm trying to address what we like all the causes that we know of right now. But the reality is that I'm still imperfect and my program is still imperfect, right? There's so much that we don't understand. So I think that having any sort of absolute certainty for the resolution of such a complex condition is foolhardy,
I agree.
right? And so I definitely agree with what you're saying. The so many people come to us with medical trauma, right? They've gone to see the regular doctor and they've been traumatized because the doctor says there's nothing wrong with you. For brain retraining programs to say, it's your fault or you're not trying hard enough, it really is traumatizing people all over again and doing them a disservice, right? So I tell people, and so many of these people, myself included, are perfectionists and hope to be recovering perfectionists, right? So I tell people, what we want is 80%, not 100%. Done is better than perfect, right? Have compassion for yourself and see where your body's at, developing that mindfulness and that awareness. Maybe now is not a time for you to be working on your nervous system retraining. We've got somebody in our program right now who's doing the Primal Trust program, which is an amazing program, but there's certain aspects of the program that triggers her and makes her stressed. And they talk about kind of like pushing through those things. And I'm just not of that opinion. I think that it's really important to take breaks, to have compassion, to process things, to pick and choose what's going to be supportive, to try to live, as Abraham Hicks says, more in those juicy moments of life, those feelings that you have that just feel really good, like live in those feelings, right? So much of it is about how can we, that's how we really tell our nervous system, to heal is when it feels safe is really when it feels good, right? Emotionally and all these different aspects. So I definitely agree. And I do also want to add to the part that you said about the mindset component where we can't just tell ourselves to feel better and all these different things. We have a 4-step mindset practice that we take people through. We also have to feel it and we have to do the body up, not just the top down. We have to do the breath work and do the humming and do the polyvagal and really feel these things in our bodies and feel and not run away from a feeling of discomfort. I was just talking about this with you previously. There's right now I have a question in my mind around my personal finances that I'm trying to figure out. I'm trying to figure out the right retirement plan right now and deciding and I am so confused and I'm trying to use AI to help me. And I have so much discomfort in my body right now. And all I'm doing is just breathing into it and observing it and being like, okay, I understand that right now you're confused. It's totally okay. We're going to get there. So I am doing some self-talk, but I'm also paying attention to the sensations in my body and being curious about them. instead of judging them and trying to run away from them. And that's been part of my journey coming from resolving my chronic fatigue syndrome.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's hugely important as well, because for me, I know some people be cross if I say this, but I'm saying it anyway. I wouldn't wish those conditions on anyone, right? I mean, I've had a 32-year relationship with it, gone to some very severe, started quite severe, very difficult experiences and all the rest of it. But for me, it's also been deeply invitational to do more than recover. It's been an invitation into a deep self-confrontation and an invitation to work on the total integration of my being. And there's something so invitational there about being able to hold space for discomfort, to stay with it, not wallow in it, not stay in a feeling, reinforcing neural pathways, but to allow the feeling to move in the body and to meet it, as you said, with curiosity, compassion, and to allow that sense of discomfort to move, because there is a really important coming into trust with self involved in that. It's like we reparent all the earlier somatic and neural material, the neural clusters that are associated with really, really early life pain experiences. And when we, at a mature age, I'm 65 now, so I'm pretty ancient. But if I can handle my 2-year-old material, which as a 2-year-old feels utterly life-threatening and overwhelming, and as a 65-year-old, if that material gets triggered and it's unhealed, it's going to feel equally life-threatening and overwhelming. But if I can hold space for that, allow it and meet it with compassion, I can come into such deep trust with my own embodied being in the world that healing becomes a very, very deep, almost inevitable experience, even if recovery doesn't. And I kind of want to draw a distinction there, because I've met some people I've worked with people who are in their 70s. They've tried everything. They've been to functionals. They've done all the programs. They're maybe advanced spiritual practitioners, but they're still not well. But they are healing. There's a deep coming into peace with self. And, if you're working with a client who's 80-something, that there's that moment in all of that where they're transitioning towards the end of life, potentially, and in some cases, literally, where healing becomes something really profound that isn't about a return to anything. It's about a moving forward into a deep human becomingness that transcends far beyond healing, retraining, and all that stuff. So I really love what you're saying there, Evan, about the capacity to be with discomfort. And I think it's probably one of the most radical invitations that conditions like this give us, if we are ballsy enough to open our arms with curiosity and say, yes, I'll allow it. And I think that's where it's problematic to say, I'll just push through stress. Because actually, sometimes in those moments, there's this deeper invitation, which is not about sublimation. It's not about suppression. It's not about dismissal. It's about, hey, I'll be present to whatever this is. But at the same time, I won't milk it for drama. I won't necessarily frame it as a big trauma. I'll just see it as sensation. I'll be curious. I'll allow it to move through as energy. Sometimes it will get painfully white hot, but then it resolves. Because no state lasts. As the Zen masters say, all states pass. And they literally do. I mean, the science on this is that they last for a maximum of 90 seconds, sometimes much less. And so, yeah, and I also think state-dependent learning, what you were saying about feeling good, being able to choose powerfully positive states and inhabit them is also a really important part of this work. And it's nothing to do with suppression, avoidance, bypassing, toxic positivity, or any of that. I think we first have to be deeply empathic to whatever pain, whatever sensation is coming up, and then say, yeah, I've felt you enough, now I can move. And with discernment, to be able to say, okay, in this situation, I'm going to state shift. In another situation, I'm going to work it out by expressive journaling. In another situation, I'm just going to get into a bed and put a weighted blanket on myself and imagine being a small baby held by my mother. But having that discernment and the capacity to float through different practices, I think, is really, really rich and inviting.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. My wife talks about noticing being a superpower, right? And it is, for me, I didn't come to it until, just recently over the past 2 years. I've been going through a psychedelic experimentation where it's kind of opened things up for me and allowed me to notice, the really intense sensations then end up allow you to understand and see a lot, oftentimes the minutia, the smaller sensations. And so that's been really big for me, is noticing those sensations, having curiosity about those, having compassion for them, making a choice for how I want to feel. I couldn't I couldn't agree more. And one of the things that you said when I interviewed you on my podcast last week that I really loved, kind of resonated or reflected what you just talked about, which is this idea that you can have healing without resolution of symptoms, right? It's more that transformation. And for people who do want to see this as a spiritual journey, they're just going to be better off for it. We don't know why we had these, and we wouldn't want to wish these symptoms on anybody, but the reality is that they're here for a reason. And like anything in life, if we see them as a learning opportunity, right? Whenever anything bad happens or uncomfortable happens, if we see it as a learning opportunity, we're curious from that end, it just transforms everything.
Yeah, and it's a useful frame, isn't it? Because if we take that frame, even if I wasn't a spiritual practitioner, which I am, but even if I wasn't, it's a really useful frame because it rehabilitates it for me in a way that automatically helps me feel safe with it, because the framing itself, priming my system for a sense of safety and purpose there, if I take that frame, and that's kind of really useful. But also with people who are really severe, who, realistically, if they're very far down the path of life and they're rather debilitated, and that they're not going to get the physical recovery that maybe someone in their 30s is going to get, because time is short and time is involved in these things. Like you said, it's bit by bit, it's step by step. Some people are never going to get there, and that's okay. It's fine that they never get there at that stage of their life. But I think it's really important for them, well, for us generally, to know that transforming our consciousness, transforming our relationship to the collective and a sense of purpose, even from a bed, is a purposive step towards a deeper sense of connection, which in itself is a healing thing. But also, if we take consciousness studies seriously, we know contributes to the whole and is not wasted. It's kind of a fundamental insight that, Christian contemplative traditions had about the power of intercessory prayer, or that mystics have had about the transformation of one individual consciousness, that, to be in the presence of a conscious being is an extraordinary experience. And for someone to reach that level of consciousness, even if they're in a bed, I think is an enormous contribution at this particular point of human history, and not to be underestimated and not to be dismissed just because there won't be resolution of symptoms and there's no recovery, whatever that means. What is it we go back to anyway? I don't want to go back to a state of being that actually introduced me to the whole complex in the first place. I actually want to move forward in an evolutionary practice of deeper becoming.
I couldn't agree more. I think that, one of the affirmations that I say as part of my mindset practice is I am safe, I'm loved, and I'm enough. And I think that last one is really significant in this context, especially because I think that, when people are lying in bed and they feel like they're not contributing to the world, they're not helping out their family or whatever it is, they just need to know that they're enough. They don't have to do anything to be enough, right? And if they just focus on consciousness and they just focus on spirituality and they meditate all day as much as they can and try to be present, that is a huge contributor. I mean, there's monks who all they do their entire lives for the benefit of humanity is meditate. That's their whole job, right? And so I think that that is really important. There is something that people can do that doesn't cost them anything, even if they are in bed, and they need to know that they're enough, even if they can't do that, because for whatever reason, they're still enough, right?
Yeah,
You're enough for just being. And I
exactly.
think having that awareness and that acceptance can help as well.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that's a fantastic note to end on, everybody listening. You are enough. We're
You are
human
enough.
beings, not human doings. You are enough. Thank you so much, Evan, as always, for a wonderful conversation. It's amazing to see you. Thank you for coming on.
Likewise, Anna. Thank you.